Following the Second World War, the victorious Allied powers, particularly the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, in the time-honored tradition of victory in war, took war prizes. In this case, the war prizes we're here to discuss are ships. Ships like Germany's Prinz Eugen or Japan's Nagato. We'll also discuss Lend-Lease ships to the Soviet Union and other vessels. Sit back and enjoy this special edition of Important Naval History. Starting off with one that caused some confusion in the past, but it would be wrong if I didn't discuss her again, as she was one of the last major warships left to the Kriegsmarine, Prinz Eugen. Our story with Prinz Eugen begins back in mid-1944 after recommissioning in 1943 and joining the Fleet Training Group. If you want to learn more about the decommissioning of all heavy units, I'll link to the playlist for this series. Anyway, in June 1944, Prinz Eugen patrolled the Finnish coast north of the island of Uto in a show of strength to cover the German withdrawal when Finland was going to leave the war. In July, there wasn't much of anything to note for her service. In August, however, there was quite a bit of action, as off Kurland in the Gulf of Riga, the cruiser spent 265 rounds of her main battery, 20.3cm or 8-inch guns on Soviet positions at Tukum, a rail and road junction about 25 kilometers inland, while our escorting destroyers and torpedo boats engaged other targets. On the 2nd of September, she returned to Finland following the nation bowing out of the war. In mid-October, the ship sailed to Gottenhofen, today what is Gdynia in Poland, for 5 days and attacked a little under 30 targets in the defense of the Baltic coast near Memel, expending almost 1,200 rounds of her main battery guns in company with another heavy cruiser that had recommissioned, the Lutzow, formerly the Deutschland. On the return to Gottenhofen on the night of the 15th at full speed, Prinz Eugen ran the light cruiser Leipzig, which was adrift while making a routine engine coupling transfer. Both ships remained locked together until the next day. Leipzig, although heavily damaged, remained afloat. While Prinz Eugen lost a section of her bow, she returned to Gottenhofen yards, where thanks to personal initiative of the naval senior architect, Professor Burkhardt, the same man who had designed the class, a new stem was added on in a few days and tested on the 14th of November. The cruiser was again operational, and on the 20th, in company with the torpedo boats T-21, T-13, T-16, and T-19, bombarded Soviet positions near the Swob Peninsula. After this, she returned to Gottenhofen again, where she was scheduled for a refit and rebore of her guns. The refit work was completed on January 15th, and only 2 weeks later, Prinz Eugen and torpedo boats covered the breakout of the 28th Corps from the bridgehead at Krens, Königsberg, where in the defense of these troops, she expended a further 871 rounds of her main battery guns. Still, the Soviet advance could not be stopped by her own or other German guns. Through the coming months of winter and spring 1945, Prinz Eugen covered the retreating German army around the Baltic, much like other ships we have discussed like the Lutzow, Admiral Hipper, and Admiral Scheer. On March 7th, the Soviets advanced on the cities of Danzig, Gdynia, and Hel. Prinz Eugen was involved in the defense of those cities from March 10th on. In the defense of those cities, a total of 2,025 rounds of 20.3cm and 2,446 15cm shells were fired by the various ships involved in the defense. During this period, Prinz Eugen also supported the old pre-dreadnought Schlesien and later the repaired Leipzig. After Hel had been evacuated and abandoned in mid-April, Prinz Eugen eventually retired to Copenhagen on April 19th, joining the light cruiser Nürnberg, where to quote Aidan Dodson and Serena Kant in Spoils of War, the fate of the enemy fleets after 2 world wars. A considerable number of German vessels were in Danish waters at the time of the surrender, in particular, those involved in the Baltic evacuations. Considerable friction resulted when Danish elements attempted to board German vessels, the latter's crews not recognizing the Danes as victors, only the British to whom they had formerly surrendered under the May 5th agreement. Apart from the big ships, the replenishment ship Nordmark, together with T-47, T-107, T-108, and T-151, and other smaller vessels, had been at Copenhagen on the 7th. On May 7th, both cruisers were taken over by the Royal Navy in the coming days. On May 7th, both cruisers were taken over by the Royal Navy. In the coming days, the two ships were escorted to Wilhelmshaven by the cruisers Devonshire and Dido, arriving in the harbor locks on the 26th of May. Prinz Eugen was lodged in the 40,000-ton floating dock in the city, but since all of her ammunition had already been shipped at Copenhagen, little else remained to be done to the heavy cruiser. On June 2nd, after a final commander's parade, a large contingent of the crew was disembarked, and those remaining aboard were subjected to close watch. Nevertheless, many objects of traditional or historical value were smuggled off the ship. During this period of being laid up, the cruiser was visited by numerous high-ranking Royal Navy officers. It proved a magical attraction, especially for naval engineers of Western powers. The remains of the German fleet were to be divided amongst the victorious powers. For example, the cruiser Nürnberg and the gunnery target ship Hessen were eventually ceded to the Soviet Union. Prinz Eugen, on the other hand, was the creme de la creme of the remaining surface units, and everybody wanted her. The USSR, because of its attempts to purchase the vessel in 1939 and a sort of prize for the bombardment of its forces over the last year of the war, the British wanted her in part for her role in sinking HMS Hood, and the Americans wanted her for the technology, if that's to be believed. There are some sources that say the United States didn't even want the ship, and one of the only reasons to have her was to keep her away from the Soviets. After much debate on how to decide who got the ships, lots were drawn. The lots were Lot X, which was Prinz Eugen, one Type 1936A destroyer and 5 other destroyers/torpedo boats; Lot Y, which was Nürnberg, 4 Type 1936A destroyers, 6 other destroyers/torpedo boats; Lot Z, 8 Type 1936A destroyers, 5 other destroyers and torpedo boats. To take from Dodson Crank again, it was not until October 29th that the British were prepared to go ahead based on the luck of the draw. And later that day, the draw took place. To the consternation of the British and the Soviets, both keen to get Prinz Eugen, Lot X fell to the Americans. Lot Y went to the USSR, and Z to the UK. This result was enshrined in the final report of the TNC, signed December 6, 1945. The Americans won, and on December 14, 1945, Prinz Eugen arrived at Bremerhaven, then an American enclave within the British zone of occupation. On January 5, 1946, Prinz Eugen was commissioned into the United States Navy under the designation IX-300 to designate that she was a war prize, but retaining the name Prinz Eugen. She left German waters that day for Britain. To sail her there and for technical investigations of her machinery and other technologies, a large part of her German crew was retained and remustered aboard, particularly the weapons specialist, signal navigation specialist, underwater acoustic staff, and engine room staff. These were important because the Americans weren't well versed in the high-pressure hot steam plant. Dodson and Kant have this to say: although both Nagato and Sakawa sailed with U.S. crews, both did not get commissioned. However, Prinz Eugen was commissioned under her original name, and the hull number was IX-300. On January 5, 1946, with a composite American-German crew, she sailed from Wesemunde for Boston in January, arriving on the 22nd. The cruiser was examined on arrival, a number of her components being removed for trials and further analysis. Her passive sonar being installed in USS Flying Fish. The guns of the foremost turret were removed at Philadelphia in February, together with 2 105mm mountings, a set of torpedo tubes, light AA guns, and several rangefinders. The cruiser arrived off the United States East Coast in late January, arriving in Boston on the 23rd, and then on to Philadelphia, leaving on February 11th for the Panama Canal, which she transited on the 15th. Once in the Pacific, a comprehensive examination of the hydrophones was undertaken, and the cruiser called in San Pedro on March 24th. From April 10th to May 1st, the torpedoes were thoroughly investigated. When the German crew was no longer needed, contingents of the German crew were disembarked in 3 groups, and on May 1st, Captain Reinecke and the remainder of the crew were landed on May 1st, 1946. The Americans subsequently had some serious problems with the cruiser's machinery. A breakdown of all but one boiler on the passage from San Diego to Hawaii. The cruiser was brought with tug assistance to Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands via Honolulu. On July 1st, 1946, the first post-war atom bomb test was carried out on a group of 11 warships, including the heavy cruiser. Prinz Eugen proved resilient to the blast, and there was little damage aboard the ship. this being test-able, although all animals were killed aboard the vessel. To take from heavy cruisers of the Admiral Hipper class, warships of the Kriegsmarine by Gerhard Koop and Klaus-Peter Schmolke, they write, "The second A device exploded on July 25th was an underwater bomb, Test Baker. The ship remained afloat, but was heavily irradiated. As a result, the intention to repair and recommission her was abandoned, and the hull was towed to Kwajalein Atoll and anchored. Because of the long period she spent in tropical waters, the stuffing glands and outboard vents of the ship began to leak, and on December 22nd she capsized. There the wreck lies today, minus various parts removed before the tests. The ship's bell hangs in the Navy Museum, Washington, the Tegethoff bell is displayed at Graz, and one of the two propellers was obtained by the German Navy League in 1979 and mounted in front of the Naval Memorial at Le Beau. The heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen and the light cruiser Nürnberg were the only two major German warships to survive the war, undamaged, and passed to the victors at capitulation. I should mention that we will cover minor vessels in a further video, whether that's German, Italian, or Japanese, or maybe a minor power. With that being said, let's look at another two major war prizes that the Americans got at the end of the war, the Japanese cruiser Sakawa and the battleship Nagato. Of the remaining vessels, we'll look at Nagato first. She was originally laid down in August 1917, armed with 8 16-inch guns, and with a top speed in excess of 26 knots. She was a powerful battleship, especially for her day, and with further reconstructions and refits, she continued to be a useful ship for the Imperial Japanese Navy throughout the interwar period right into the Second World War, where she saw service first as the flagship for the combined fleet. In this capacity, it was from her decks that the orders to start the Pacific War were issued, where, to be honest, her wartime service isn't all that exciting until about 1944, where to take from Mark Still in the Imperial Japanese Navy in the Pacific War. After the Japanese defeat at the Philippine Sea, Nagato returned to Japan for refit and repair. By July, it had returned to Linga and was now assigned to Force A of the 1st Striking Force. Nagato and 6 other of the IJN's battleships departed Linga on October 18th to attack the American invasion force at Leyte. On October 24th, Nagato suffered 2 near misses in the morning, and in the afternoon, it was hit by 2 bombs and experienced 3 near misses. Damage was light, but the ship's speed was impaired temporarily. Force A came upon the 6 escort carriers of Taffy 3. For the first time of the war, Nagato used her guns in anger, opening fire at 20 miles. Overall, she played a minor role in the battle and damaged one of the escorting destroyers. While she retired, she was struck by 2 more bombs, of which one destroyed her anchor deck. Overall, despite the aerial attacks over the 2-day period, her damage was light. After Leyte Gulf, Nagato returned to Japan in November 1944, and with no fuel available, she was modified for use as a floating anti-aircraft battery and was assigned to Yokosuka Naval District. In April 1945, Nagato was reassigned once again, this time as a reserve ship. She was stripped of her remaining 5.5-inch guns and almost all of her anti-aircraft guns, which were removed to a nearby mountain. The crew was reduced to 1,000 men, and Nagato was heavily camouflaged, with her main guns covered with scaffolding and trees placed upon her upper decks. This effort in camouflaging was for naught, as she was subjected to carrier air attacks on July 18, 1945. 1 bomb hit the bridge, causing heavy casualties, and another hit after the mainmast. This was the only damage, and in this condition, Nagato was the last surviving Japanese battleship of the war, and on August 30th, 1945, she was boarded and taken over by the United States Navy. Moving briefly over to Sakawa, she was a light cruiser built during the Second World War, being completed in late November 1944, being armed with 3 twin 6-inch guns, plenty of AA guns, especially the 25mm morale boosters, a 35-knot top speed, and, interestingly enough, radar. She was assigned to Destroyer Squadron 11 in December 1944, and due to fuel shortages, she was unable to participate in the 10 Ichigo operation, where she remained in the inland sea on training duties until July 1945. She was surrendered intact to the Allied powers. So, with that being said, Nagato and Sakawa were allocated to the United States Navy, and although they sailed with U.S. crews, they were never fully commissioned into the United States Navy, unlike the German cruiser Prinz Eugen. In any case, in early February 1946, Sakawa was taken away from repatriation duty and took on a USN crew, and departed Yokosuka for Enowitak on March 18th. She was accompanied by the Nagato, which had run trials in Tokyo Bay during the past couple of weeks. On the 28th, though, both broke down 300 nautical miles away from their destination and were taken in tow by tugs on the 30th. Sakawa arrived on April 1st, followed by Nagato on the 4th. Both were repaired to a certain extent, just enough to get them to their final destination, Bikini Atoll. Again, taking from Dodson and Kant. There, they became part of a fleet of unwanted vessels to be used as targets for Operation Crossroads, a series of tests to explore the effect of nuclear explosions. Sakawa was moored less than a quarter-mile away from the initial explosion of Test Able. In contrast, Nagato was moored close to a mile away from the explosions. Taking from Bombs at Bikini by William A. Shercliffe, an unusual must, not normally applicable to manned ships, was making the ships almost perfectly watertight. A fact not fully realized by the public is that the majority of warships, even warships which had never been in battle, leak slightly, particularly in older ships. It is almost impossible to make all joints perfectly tight. The slight continual inflow of water is of no consequence ordinarily. It is easily pumped out, but in this operation, where the ships might have to remain for weeks without crews and without pumps operating, such leaks might be very serious. There was some danger that the captured Japanese ships Nagato and Sakawa might actually sink from this cause if they were left unattended for 3 or 4 weeks. In Test Able, Sakawa was severely damaged on July 1st, and she foundered the next day. In contrast, Nagato sustained only superficial damage, but during Test Baker on July 24th, the underwater explosion caused more damage. She was boarded and a boiler activated for 36 hours, but during the night on the 29th, progressive flooding led to the battleship capsizing in 164 feet of water. Again taking from Bombs at Bikini, the ex-Japanese battleship Nagato sank during the night, 4.5 days after Mike Hour. Only a few hours after Mike Hour, she took on a list of about 5 degrees. The list increased so slowly that many observers expected her to survive. When her characteristic silhouette failed to show itself on the morning of July 30th, surprise was general. No one had seen her sink. Undoubtedly, openings had been made in her hull, of which the wreck is still down there, and like the cruiser Prinz Eugen, people like to dive it. There's some excellent pictures online, really worth a Google. Now, the Regia Marina was in an interesting position as in 1943, the Italian government had torn away from their German allies to turn to the invading Allied powers, and with that, a period of co-belligerency with the Allied powers began. However, for a vast majority of the remainder of the Second World War, the major surface vessels of the Regia Marina were inactive in Allied-controlled ports, notably the remaining battleships of the Littorio class, Italia and Vittorio Veneto, with their sister Roma being sunk by German-guided bombs in September 1943. To stray away from the complex negotiations, the Italian government signed a peace treaty in Paris in 1947, which came into effect on September 15th of that year, in which the once powerful Italian Navy was going to be broken up, the Allied powers such as France, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and of course the United States receiving ships. Under the provisions of the treaty, the Italian Navy would retain 2 battleships, the 2 Andrea Doria-class ships, 4 cruisers, 4 destroyers, 13 torpedo boats, 20 corvettes, 8 smaller boats, and a range of auxiliary vessels. Excess vessels beyond those limits were to be placed at the disposal of the nations previously mentioned. The vessels that were to be handed over needed to be fully equipped, in operational condition, including a full outfit of armament stores, and complete with onboard spare parts and all necessary technical data. The big question to answer is, what ships did everyone want? Well, other nations like Greece and Yugoslavia wanted smaller vessels like destroyers, with Greece receiving 2 light cruisers and a third for cannibalization, while Yugoslavia got several torpedo boats. Now, France received some of Italy's most interesting vessels of the Capitani Romani class, like Attila Regolo, Pompeo Magno, and Scipio Africano, and some other smaller craft. The Soviets received the elderly battleship Giulio Cesare, even though their ambitions earlier were to receive a Littorio-class ship. They did receive other ships like cruisers, submarines, and destroyers. Now, the Americans and British were very eager to each get their hands on a Littorio-class vessel, with the British to receive Vittorio Veneto, and the United States to receive the Italia, the former Littorio, and of course smaller craft. The British had some consideration for reactivation of the Italian ship, as their fleet was becoming rather old by 1947, with Vanguard of course being the newest battleship. But as we learned in my Fates of the Littorio class video, Vittorio Veneto would be scrapped, while the United States declaration was rather interesting. The USA made its announcement on October 5th, stating that it wished its allocation of vessels to be scrapped and utilized as a contribution to the continued recovery of the Italian economy. However, at this point, the list of which nation would receive what had not been made available to Italy, and while the British had now made a decision in principle to waive for scrap all but Vittorio Veneto and 3 of the MTBs, no announcement was yet forthcoming. One concern of giving up the battleship was that the Soviets might then raise the idea of a swap of one of the now-to-be scrapped Littorios for their ancient Cesare. The Italians would take their time in scrapping Vittorio Veneto and Italia, hoping to delay for as long as possible as to possibly retain the 2 battleships, at least for training purposes. Nevertheless, they were broken up in the 1950s, with the Soviets asking for a possible swap for the unwanted modern battleships. Thus, the United States did not receive any major warship from the Regia Marina. First up, we have the British battleship, the Royal Sovereign. To give some background details, the ship was completed in May 1916, displacing some 30,000 tons and 18 Babcock and Wilcox boilers, giving steam to Parsons turbines, producing 43,000 shaft horsepower, and a top speed of just about 22 knots. She was armed with 8 15-inch 42 caliber guns and twin turrets, 2 forward and 2 aft, and 14 6-inch 45 caliber guns and casemates, 2 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, 4 3-pounders, 5 machine guns, 10 Lewis guns, and 4 underwater torpedo tubes. As for armor, the main thing I will note is that unlike the Queen Elizabeth class, the R-class had a uniform main belt of 13 inches and did not reduce to 8 inches below the waterline. There were other modifications to the armor, but overall, they were almost identical to the QEs. As many of you know, May 31st through the 1st of June 1916 was the Battle of Jutland, but the Royal Sovereign was not worked up and so was held back at Scapa Flow for the battle. With no major fleet action for the remainder of the war, she spent her time drilling and patrolling. In the interwar period, she alternated between the Atlantic Fleet, the Mediterranean, and back to the home fleet by the time war broke out. Like the Queen Elizabeth's, the Revenge class saw several refits throughout the interwar period that improved their fighting capabilities, just not to the extent some of the more radical reconstructions the QEs had, which by the time the Second World War kicked off in September 1939, made the R-class a less capable fighting unit than the modernized Queen Elizabeth's. A great example of this is Royal Sovereign at the Battle of Calabria, where Admiral Andrew Cunningham, although with other hindrances, one of his chief ones was his speed was limited by the Royal Sovereign. By 3:50 p.m. on July 9, 1940, when Warspite was about to engage the 2 Italian dreadnoughts Conte di Cavour and Giulio Cesare, the battleship Malaya had close to 3,000 yards of the flagship, where the Royal Sovereign lagged 5 miles behind, remaining widely separated and out of range for the engagement. It had nothing to do with the efforts of the crew. They strained her engines as hard as they could. Their problem was the fact that they could barely get 20 knots out of the ship, and by this point, her sister Ramillies couldn't even exceed that if she wanted to. With that being said, she continued to serve, mainly on escort duty in the North Atlantic after this, and spent some time with the Eastern Fleet for convoy duty in the Indian Ocean, going to Philadelphia Dockyard for a refit between 1942 and October 1943, where her light anti-aircraft battery was greatly augmented. Due to manpower shortages, she was paid off and put in the reserve because there was more capable battleships in service. As I mentioned in my video on the Novorossiysk, it was no secret that Joseph Stalin longed for a modern navy, as with the Soviet buildup of their battleships, the modernizations of the Gangets, and the buildup of destroyers and cruisers, some of them coming from Italian yards, and from the defeated Regia Marina, Stalin hoped to secure one of their modern battleships of the Littorio class, which we will discuss a bit later on. Thus, with the upgrades to the Royal Sovereign in mind, and her being in the reserve, When the question arose of temporarily transferring ships to the Soviet Union instead of the immediate delivery of a portion of the Italian fleet, as it was not practical with the continuation of the war and Italian co-belligerency, the Royal Sovereign was in good enough shape and available. After negotiations, it was agreed that the Royal Navy would loan Royal Sovereign 9 destroyers and 4 submarines. On May 30th, 1944, the Soviet flag was raised on Royal Sovereign in Newcastle. Royal Sovereign became the Archangel, named for the northern port city, which I won't even try the Russian pronunciation, as it just comes out as a jumbled mess. Like a lot of these ships, it's incredibly hard to get details about her service with the Soviet Navy, and I'll detail what little there is. One of the more interesting facts is that her crew was mostly comprised of former crew members of the battleship Petropavlovsk, the ex-Jean-Paul Marat, and if you don't know who that name is, give it a Google, he's quite the character. Anyway, the ship was added to the Soviet Navy list on May 9th, 1944, even before she was officially transferred. It was some time before she was worked up with her new crew, departing Scapa Flow as part of convoy JW-59 in early August 1944. Probably for the best that the ship was in a convoy, because by this point, the elderly battleship could barely make 19 knots, because her machinery needed a rather large and expensive overhaul. During which operation, it was attacked by the U-boat U-711, but the torpedoes would detonate short of their target. Not the last time a German submarine would threaten the ship. Arriving at the Soviet port of Vyanga on the 24th of August. The ship rotated between there, Murmansk, or Palerny for the remainder of the war. In September and early October, several attacks by U-boats U-315 and U-313 were thwarted by net defenses while the ship was moored near Murmansk. Another attack was halted by mechanical failures, this time by 6 German midget submarines, often referred to as. After the German surrender, the Archangel made several cruises in the Barents and White Seas, running aground in the fall of 1947 in the White Sea Inlet. All the while back in the United Kingdom, there were calls to have the ship returned, notably by Winston Churchill, who, when he loaned the ship, the irony of the name Royal Sovereign going to the Soviet Union was not lost on him. There were several attempts to get the battleship returned to the United Kingdom, with Stalin basically hoping the British would forget about it and he could keep it. The Prime Minister said, "I can see no reason why we, in return for such help to Russia and Italy, should leave our ship in Russian hands. We are entitled to get those ships back, and the scrap would be extremely useful to us at the present moment." The Admiralty saw no value in ships like Royal Sovereign, especially considering the fact that she hadn't received any major work while in Russian hands the past 4 years. And when they did hand her over, she wasn't exactly in the best condition. Still, after more hemming and hawing by the Soviets, she was returned in 1949 when the Soviets received their portion of the Italian fleet and received the Italian dreadnought Giulio Cesare. Royal Sovereign returned to the United Kingdom in what can only be described as an awful state, with reports detailing her being covered in rust, live rounds loaded in the guns, and some even being rusted in place. Unsurprisingly, the ship was put on the disposal list almost immediately and was sent to be scrapped a short time later. Next up, we have the American cruiser USS Milwaukee. The light cruiser was one of 10 scout cruisers of the Omaha class, being intended to answer the need for fleet scouts, with the lack of cruisers in the United States Navy when she was laid down in December 1918. She came at a unique time for U.S. cruiser design, with her 10 6-inch guns with 4 in twin turrets and the rest in casemates. And a rarity for U.S. cruisers, she carried torpedoes. And with her large machinery spaces, she had the ability to make 35 knots. Milwaukee had a rather pedestrian service career upon commissioning in June 1923, serving overseas, even participating in a showing of the flag mission in early 1938 in the Pacific after the Panay incident in 1937. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, she was in the New York Navy Yard, and by the end of the month, she was escorting convoys in the Caribbean. Since there were newer light cruisers in service, and even more about to come into service, coupled with her age, Milwaukee wasn't exactly a frontline unit anymore. Instead, she served as a convoy escort for the next 2 years in the Brazil-based South Atlantic Patrol Force, helping with the capture of German blockade runners and fighting fires on merchant ships that had been torpedoed by German submarines. The state of affairs quickly changed in February 1944, and she then joined a North Atlantic convoy to the United Kingdom, where her fate to serve with the Soviets would soon become known. The Allies agreeing to loan the Soviets comparable ships until the transaction with the Italian ships could be completed, and Milwaukee was offered. Soviet naval officers commented on the fact that Milwaukee was perfectly suitable, even comparing it to some of their own in the Black Sea Fleet. Anyway, on March 27th, Milwaukee and 50 other ships set out in convoy JW-58 from Lock U bound for Murmansk. With one American writing about the cold, "We came to the conclusion that the only possible way for us not to freeze is to put on all of our clothes. You can pull your socks over your feet, wrap your feet over the socks with towels, and then shove them into your boots." After this freezing Arctic convoy, arriving in the Kola Inlet on April 4th. Half the US crew shipped out with an outbound convoy, and they were replaced by 249 officers and men of the Soviet Navy. When they reported for active instruction. With all the guns being test-fired, including the 6-inch guns and 3-inch guns, the speed was tested, getting up to 31 knots. Both aircraft the ship carried were launched, and one depth charge dropped for good measure. At 11:04 a.m. on the 20th of April, 1944, the Milwaukee was officially delivered to the Soviet government, with the admiral in charge of the Northern Fleet accepting her, raising the Soviet naval ensign and giving her the name Murmansk. The Soviet captain remarked on the nature of the Milwaukee and Royal Sovereign service with the Soviet Navy, saying it was more political than military in nature, since our fleet could not yet fully use such large combat units. Like the Archangel, a lot of Murmansk's time in the Soviet fleet was spent at anchor. She did participate with other units of the fleet as the Soviet crew became more comfortable, at least more often than Archangel, even leading a detachment of destroyers on gunnery practice in the summer of 1944, and then in the autumn she assisted in a convoy operation. Next, in July 1945, she and Archangel sortied with 6 destroyers for another training cruise, exercising their defensive capabilities. Unlike the Archangel, the Murmansk actually had work done on her while in Soviet service, entering the Rostov shipyards for repairs in November of that year. After that, she became more active in training cruises, but by 1947, those had ended. When another ship we'll talk about later on, the Italian Emanuele Filiberto Duca d'Aosta, renamed Kerch, was officially handed over to the Soviets in the spring of 1949, the Murmansk was transferred back to the US, being the last of the Omaha class in service. When the Milwaukee came back, she was sold for scrap and broken up in Wilmington, Delaware. Another interesting ship was the ex-German pre-dreadnought battleship Schleswig-Holstein. If you've watched my video on the attack on the Westerplatte, you'd know 2 important things. The first was the ship helped to start the Second World War, firing some of the first shots of the war in the free city of Danzig. But you'd also know that in the end, I left her fate ambiguous because I didn't know what happened to her. After all, I couldn't find a reliable source. However, I can finally rectify that here. The Linienschiff, or battleship, came from a different era, being part of the 1905 building program of the Imperial German Navy and being laid down around the same time as HMS Dreadnought, the ship that made her obsolete. Schleswig-Holstein saw service throughout the Great War and even participated in several actions, including the Battle of Jutland. Following the war, she was one of the outdated pre-dreadnoughts that the new Kriegsmarine was allowed to keep according to the Treaty of Versailles. In the interwar period, she was modernized to a certain extent, notably her secondary battery, and helped to train the sailors of the new German Navy. Eventually, as Hitler pursued more and more aggressive foreign policies, she found herself on the front lines of the next war. After she played her part in the capture of Danzig, she went on to see some other bombardment missions and carry out training cruises for the majority of her wartime service. But the old battleship was taken into the Deutsche Werke dock at Gottenhofen, or today Gdynia, for conversion work into a convoy escort ship. With the removal of her existing secondary battery and anti-aircraft guns, she was to carry at least 6 10.5cm guns, 10 4cm Bofors, 4 3.7cm guns, and as many as 20 2cm guns. New fire control systems and rangefinders were going to be fit to the ship. Not only that, her machinery was going to get a refit as well. New pumps and degaussing equipment as well. But the refit did not happen, and the armament changes most likely didn't occur. On December 18, 1944, while the ship was in dock, she was heavily damaged during an RAF raid, with one bomb exploding in the port engine room, another one amidships, and a third passing through without exploding. On March 21, 1945, as the Soviets approached the city, her crew scuttled the damaged ship in shallow water. This is where things start to get a bit more interesting, as for many years, and to my confusion, it was believed that the ship was scrapped in place. However, in the early 1990s, researchers found that the Soviets had in fact towed her back to Tallinn in the spring of 1946. On September 26, 1946, she was enrolled into the Soviet fleet. It was reported that the Soviets were going to use her as a training ship or a target ship or some other use, but they soon found that the ship was actually of no use, and on July 25th, 1947, she was sunk in the Gulf of Finland. Whether she was given an official name isn't clear, although some sources claim that she was given the name Borodino. It should be noted that this rather prestigious name is unlikely. However, in the early 1990s, researchers found that the Soviets had towed her back to Tallinn in the spring of 1946. It was reported that the Soviets were going to use her as a training ship, target ship, or some other use. She was sunk in the Gulf of Finland, and whether she was given an official name isn't clear, although some sources claim she was given the name Borodino, this rather prestigious name being unlikely. To gain some more clarity on this situation, let's look at Spoils of War, The Fate of Enemy Fleets After Two World Wars by Aidan Dodson and Serena Kant, where they write, in addition to these two ships, the Italian Giulio Cesare and the Finnish Viborg, the USSR was in possession of several other capital ships, all of which were placed in Category C and were thus due for destruction by August 15, 1946. This was not achieved until October of the following year, when the destruction of these vessels was certified. In the interim, the Soviet authorities had indeed toyed with the idea of retaining and repairing some vessels, with Schleswig-Holstein added to the Navy list in March 1946 and Graf Zeppelin in September 1945 as a potential trial ship for future Soviet-built aircraft carriers. However, their poor condition, leaving aside the international obligations, made this untenable, and all ships in question were directed in March 1947 to be destroyed. They go on to report that Schleswig-Holstein was beached in shallow water off the Estonian coast at the mouth of the Gulf of Finland for long-term use as a target on June 26, of which I believe you can still find some photos of the ship in the area. It's worth a Google. While we're talking about pre-dreadnoughts, the Soviets also took the Hessen as a war prize. The elderly battleship had been converted into a radio-controlled target ship in the mid-1930s and had the armor to withstand heavy-caliber guns. And in early 1946, she was commissioned into the Soviet fleet, taking the name Cel, literally target. Surprisingly enough, she served in this target ship role into the 1960s, where she was stricken and broken up. I should mention other German vessels like submarines and other small craft the Soviets acquired after the war. Next up, we have the Lutzow, laid down on August 2nd, 1937. The ship was launched on July 1st, 1939. The hull was fitted on the stocks with the Atlantic prow, in contrast to the Four Sisters, which had been launched with a straight stem. Once the Second World War broke out, completion work slowed due to the demands of the war, something akin to the incomplete aircraft carrier Graf Zeppelin. Shortly before Operation Barbarossa and the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Germans and Soviets had a non-aggression pact. In addition to covering their back, the Soviets expressed a strong interest in acquiring new warships, of which, amongst others, the cruiser Lutzow, Seydlitz, the complete Prinz Eugen, and possibly the battleship Bismarck headed the list. Admiral Erich Raeder didn't necessarily want to transfer any ships or materials except concerning the Lutzow. On the 15th of April 1940, the unfinished vessel was taken in tow to Leningrad and handed over to the Soviet Navy. Around 70 men headed with the ship, acting as advisors until June 1941, when they were recalled before the German attack. To take from Koop and Schmolke again, the Soviets renamed the ship Petropavlovsk. Building work was not undertaken with any urgency, and she was still short of completion when Germany invaded on June 22, 1941. Leningrad was obviously to be a major objective, and the so-called Battleflotte, comprised of all Russian units in the Baltic in August 1941, was formed into a support flotilla for the Leningrad front. The first group was concentrated on the Neva front, the second with the partially immobile cruiser Maxim Gorky, the incomplete Petropavlovsk ex-Lutzow, with only the two main forward turrets fitted. The destroyer Leningrad as flotilla leader, 5 other destroyers and a mine layer lay off Leningrad. The third group was concentrated on the Oranienburg-Kronstadt area. On the 15th of September 1941, the Petropavlovsk was slightly damaged by German 15-centimeter shells from artillery inland. She did survive the shelling and the deterioration in the local military situation 3 days later. Luftwaffe raids in early April caused serious damage to the ship, and she sank and grounded in shallow water. She was refloated in September 1942 with her main guns intact, enabling her to continue to engage land targets. From autumn of 1943, she served as a floating battery. In the period between January 14th and the 21st, 1944, Soviet troops broke through the ring encircling the city of Leningrad. The battle float, which included the Petropavlovsk, which was now called the Talon, contributed to this breakout. She was laid up for a long period after the war, where she was scrapped in 1960. Finally, we have the longest-serving Kriegsmarine vessel, the Nürnberg or Admiral Makarov. Nürnberg was the second ship of the Leipzig class, being the last light cruiser Germany would build before the Second World War. Like the preceding K-class, she had issues due to the limitations placed on her and the other cruisers from the Versailles Treaty. Where I am going to beat a dead horse because this quote is very important to explain her lack of robustness. Gerhard Koop and Klaus-Peter Schmolke discuss this in their book German Light Cruisers of World War II, Warships of the Kriegsmarine. The 5 latter German light cruisers were children of their time, the result of what designers had found possible to engineer within the limitations of the Washington Agreement and a vast improvement on Emden, except as regards seaworthiness. The great weakness of the K-cruisers, Königsberg, Kulm, and Karlsruhe, was their light construction. The fault lay not with the designers, but in the restrictions of the Versailles Treaty. With that being said, because Nürnberg was constructed later on, and therefore benefited from some liberties taken by the constructors in the Anglo-German Naval Treaty, they again write, the displacement infringed treaty limitations considerably, whereas that of the K-cruisers had only been marginally in excess. The usual excuse that the extra weight was also equivalent to that of all the guns was not mentioned. Both ships were shorter on the waterline and beamier than the K-class. The broader beam made a different arrangement possible for the engine room. For the same number of boilers, there were 3 boiler rooms. The ship entered service in 1936 and served throughout the Second World War, surviving a torpedo hit in late 1939, which put her out of action for a while. In early 1942, refits to the cruiser saw upgraded radar, and the ship was used as a training ship until November, when she was sent to Narvik to replace the Admiral Scheer. Besides switching around ports, she was never used. In 1943, the ship was part of the order for all heavy units to be decommissioned and returned to Germany as a training ship in the Baltic. From 1944 onwards, any ship afloat was used as an escort for convoys as the situation for the German military became worse and worse. In early 1945, Nürnberg was used to lay mines off the southern tip of Norway, and then escorted refugee ships through the swept channels, and ended up in Oslo on the 24th of January. She was then called to Copenhagen, where she remained until the end of the war. Following the surrender of German forces in northern Germany on May 5th, Danish resistance fighters attempted to seize the cruiser, and both sides suffered heavy losses in a fierce gunfight in the docks of Copenhagen. Later on the 22nd, the ship was ordered to Wilhelmshaven, and then 2 days later, a convoy including the heavy cruiser HMS Devonshire, Prinz Eugen, Nürnberg, and HMS Dido, along with destroyers, left for Wilhelmshaven, entering the port on the 26th. According to the terms of the Potsdam Agreement, the victorious powers agreed the German fleet would be shared amongst themselves by February 15, 1946. There were suspected attempts to scuttle the German ships by their crews to prevent them from reaching Allied control, especially Soviet. So without prior notice, on December 18, 1945, the German ships were taken over. On January 2, 1946, Nürnberg, wearing the flag of a Soviet vice admiral, left Wilhelmshaven for the Soviet Union only after encountering troubles with locks. Eventually, Nürnberg reached Libau, where the German crew was taken off and returned to Wilhelmshaven. Nürnberg was thoroughly examined by the Soviet Union. There, Nürnberg was renamed Admiral Makarov and served in a frontline role, although mainly being used as a training ship by the Soviet Navy. The torpedo tubes, light flak, and searchlight platforms were removed, and Russian electronic equipment was installed. Her outward appearance remained the same. She served in the Soviet Navy until about 1960, when she was decommissioned, making her the longest-serving Kriegsmarine cruiser. To clean up this section and a few other loose ends from this series, let's look at Spoils of War, The Fate of Enemy Fleets After Two World Wars by Aidan Dodson and Serena Kant. They write, in addition to these 2 ships, the Italian Giulio Cesare and the Finnish Viborg, the USSR was in possession of several other capital ships, all of which were placed in Category C, and were thus due for destruction by August 15, 1946. This was not achieved until October of the following year, when the destruction of these vessels was certified. In the interim, the Soviet authorities had indeed toyed with the idea of retaining and repairing some vessels, with Schleswig-Holstein added to the Navy list in March 1946 and Graf Zeppelin in September 1945, as a potential trial ship for future Soviet-built aircraft carriers. However, their poor condition, leaving aside the international obligations, made this untenable, and all ships in question were directed in March 1947 to be destroyed. They go on to report that to gain the highest possible value from the heavy cruiser Lutzow, Graf Zeppelin, and the Schleswig-Holstein, they were to be expended in ordnance trials in the summer of 1947, of which we will cover Schleswig-Holstein in the next installment. While the Lutzow, as discussed in her section in a previous video, had a mysterious end, or so I thought, as Kant and Dodson report that she was refloated and sunk in the central Baltic on July 22, 1947. Finally, Graf Zeppelin, renamed PB-101, was the subject of similar trials as she was sunk in a live fire exercise, proving to be rather tough, surviving multiple simulated bomb hits and torpedoes, going down in the late summer of 1947. You can find photographs of her wreck online. A very interesting Google if you feel so inclined. Another interesting ship that doesn't necessarily come to mind when you think of war prizes is the Finnish coastal defense ship Väinämöinen. Before we continue, I think we should appreciate the beauty of Väinämöinen, as I think she and her sister Ilmarinen are some of my favorite ships of the Second World War. But they were built by the Finnish in the 1920s, as their navy was comprised of outdated former Imperial Russian naval vessels that weren't exactly what the nation needed for coastal defense work. Thus, through the assistance of foreign powers, the Finns built two 4,000-ton ships with a top speed of 14.5 knots, an armament of 4 10-inch guns, 8 dual-purpose 4-inch guns, and a light anti-aircraft armament. The ships had a very large armament for their size and could assist the considerable Finnish coastal defense network in case of war with the Soviets. In said war, the Winter War, the ships were sent to Åland to protect the island from invasion and then to other cities. During the Continuation War, Ilmarinen was sunk by mines, while Väinämöinen continued to serve with the Finnish Navy until the end of the Continuation War. Where to take from Dodson and Kahn again? The other ex-enemy capital ship to serve in the Soviet Navy was the ex-Finnish Viborg, handed over on May 29, 1947. She was based for 6 years at Porkala, leased by Finland to the Soviet Union by the terms of the Moscow Armistice of 1944, undertaking several training cruises between 1947 and 1949. Following the discovery of major defects during a 1952 refit at Kronstadt, she underwent extensive work at Tallinn from 1953 to 1957, with her engines and electronic equipment being replaced. Viborg then returned to training duties, but was reduced to reserve in 1958. Attempts at interesting the Finns in repurchasing having failed, she was stricken in 1966 and broken up. Next up, we'll discuss the Regia Marina and some of the other vessels that they had to hand over, because I've already discussed Giulio Cesare at length in another video. And if you haven't seen that, it will pop up on screen now. Like I mentioned in that video, the Italians handed over some 51,464 tons, including the Giulio Cesare, light cruiser, the Emanuele Filiberto Duca d'Aosta, several destroyers, 3 torpedo boats, 2 submarines, and 35 other vessels. On February 10, 1947, Italy signed the peace treaty imposed on her by the victors in Paris, involving the loss of territory, material, and moral sacrifices, where Mino Bagnesco and Augusto de Toro in Italian battleships Conte di Cavour and Duilio classes 1911 to 1956 write, "The greatest bitterness came from the treatment of the Italian fleet, as if it were war booty to be divided up amongst the victors." The battleships were divided up, with the British and Americans receiving 2 of the Littorio class, and the Italians were allowed to keep the Duilios. It should be noted that Italy was forced to give up other ships to France and Greece as well. Nevertheless, the treaty was not exactly popular with the Italian people or navy. Again quoting De Toro and Bagnesco, "The delivery of these vessels was seen by Italian sailors as well as the greater part of the population, not only as unfair and humiliating, but also as a renewed and unequivocal sign of defeat, which co-belligerency had managed to erase from the mind of many. The delivery of these ships was going to be made because of the discipline of the officers and crews, avoiding the real danger of the possible dissolution of the Italian navy. Another aspect of this was some plans were foiled to sabotage Giulio Cesare and other ships before they were handed over to the Soviet Union. The treaty stipulated that the ships were to be ready for service, i.e. in operational condition by September 15th, 1947, which for a lot of these ships was not going to happen. After some negotiating, Moscow agreed in July 1948 that the ships could be handed over in their current condition. By December 1948, the Giulio Cesare and other ships promised to the Soviet Union were on their way with full stores of everything the ships could need, making a stop at the Albanian port of Valona, where some of these ships were going to be handed over. I should say that in some sources, they discuss multiple ways of ships going to the Soviet Union in the spring of 1949, where documents were finally signed handing the ships over to the Soviet Union. The Italian crews were treated rather harshly, quickly removing them from their posts and keeping them under guard on the forecastle of the ships. The Soviets were very worried about the prospect of sabotage. The Soviets searched the ships up and down, looking for any explosive devices, but they didn't find any. The ships assumed, although still provisionally, new names for their Soviet service. As we know from the video on the now Novorossiysk, she became the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet. She spent her time in and out of refits, as well as a training ship until her demise in late October 1955 at the hands of most likely a German wartime mine still in Sevastopol harbor. The Duca d'Aosta was given the provisional name Z-15 when she was transferred to the Soviets, eventually taking the name Kerch. Like a lot of these ships, there isn't much information on this ship in Soviet service. What we do know is that she served as an active unit into the mid-1950s with the Black Sea Fleet, and then as a training cruiser. With new Soviet cruisers coming into service during the 1960s, she was scrapped sometime during the decade. The destroyers and submarines also served as active fleet units well into the 1950s and some into the 60s. The British, and more specifically the Royal Navy, had been fighting the Axis forces since 1939, and at least in the European theater, at one point, were facing them alone. As the war drew to a close, quite a few German ships were remaining, from U-boats to heavy cruisers like the Prinz Eugen, of which the Royal Navy had captured quite a few of the remaining German vessels, including Prinz Eugen and the light cruiser Nürnberg in Copenhagen, along with the remains of the Admiral Hipper, Admiral Scheer, and Emden and Kiel, to name a few. Of course, as I mentioned, there was much smaller craft that they captured, just to be even more clear. It's rather annoying to list them all off, but to the victors goes the spoils. So they were going to have to figure out how to divide everything up. Although I think it's interesting to note for Prinz Eugen in this period, the cruiser was visited by numerous high-ranking Royal Navy officers. It proved a magical attraction, especially for naval engineers in the Western powers. The remains of the German fleet were to be divided amongst the victorious powers. For example, the cruiser Nürnberg and the gunnery target ship Hessen were eventually ceded to the Soviet Union. Prinz Eugen, on the other hand, was the creme de la creme of the remaining surface units, and everybody wanted her. The USSR because of its attempts to purchase the vessel in 1939, and a sort of prize for the bombardment of its forces during the last year of the war. The British wanted her, in part, for a role in sinking HMS Hood, and the Americans wanted her for her technology, if that's to be believed. And one of the only reasons to have her was to keep her away from the Soviets. After much debate on how to decide who got the ships, lots were drawn. The lots were Lot X, Prinz Eugen, one Type 1936A destroyer, and 5 other destroyer/torpedo boats. Lot Y, which had Nuremberg, 4 Type 1936A destroyers, 6 other destroyers/torpedo boats. Lot Z, 8 Type 1936 destroyers, 5 other destroyers and torpedo boats. To take from Dodson and Kant again, it was not until October 29th that the British were prepared to go ahead based on the luck of the draw, and later that day the draw took place. To the consternation of the British and the Soviets, both keen to get Prinz Eugen, Lot X fell to the Americans, Lot Y went to the USSR, and Z to the UK. The results were enshrined in the final report of the TNC, signed December 6, 1945. The Americans had won, and on December 14, 1945, Prinz Eugen arrived at Bremerhaven, then an American exclave within the British zone of occupation. With that, the British had gotten the short end of the stick when it comes to the lots. So what were the ships the British got? Well, they got Z-10 Lady, Z-25, Z-31, Z-38, and T-108, of which they were the seaworthy ones, although Z-10 and T-108 had some minor issues. Z-4, Z-5, Z-6, and Z-30 all required significant work. The latter included a new stern. Z-38 happened to be in UK waters already, that is, of early 1946. Z-19, Z-25, T-23, and T-108 sailed for Portsmouth on January 6, 1946. Z-6 Jacobi left for Rosyth on the 16th, in company with the escort vessel F-4, the seaplane tender Volta Holzstaffel, and the experimental torpedo-firing ship ex Costa Frida Peters, followed a few days later by Z-6. The immobilized Z-30 and Z-4 were towed from Oslo, Norway to Rosyth in early February. Before we continue, I think it's important to note something from Kant and Dodson. The UK had no interest in the long-term employment of ex-enemy vessels, only wishing to run trials with a few of the more technically interesting examples. These comprise ships with high-pressured boilers, submarines with high underwater speeds, and minesweepers with Voigt propulsors. Thus, most were intended for early scrapping or sinking. The exceptions are German units that the UK reallocated to France, and other allies excluded from the Potsdam share-out, such vessels being transferred as soon as possible after having been formally taken over by the UK. In doing so, the Admiralty fell foul of UK Treasury procedures since the ex-German ships had become British assets and thus should have been written off through Treasury minutes, which did not occur. Accordingly, a reprimand was issued by the Treasury in August 1947 when a similar retransfer of surrendered Japanese tonnage was being considered. I included that last little bit because I found it interesting as an accountant. Anyway, at the end of December 1945, the plan was that Z-10 and Z-38 would be used for long-term trials, to last up to 2 years, with Z-4 and Z-30 acting as spare parts donors, to become targets after stripping. T-23 would be used for more basic trials and then join the remaining modern vessels in being given to France. Her condition was judged to be too poor and she just joined the main group heading to France. Z-4, on the other hand, was in what can be described as a piss-poor condition, including bottom damage from near misses, and had to be beached in December 1946 to avoid sinking, being added to the disposal list the following month, and she was scrapped in 1949. Z-30 was fit to be taken to Lochstriven, where various surplus ships were being employed to determine the effects of underwater explosions. Between May and September 1948, 3 charges were detonated at various depths below her hull, and despite some damage, she remained intact and was handed over for scrapping following the trials. Before I forget, some of the vessels I mentioned previously in Kiel, like the Emden, Admiral Scheer, and Admiral Hipper, were far beyond any repair, and according to the Potsdam Agreement, were a Category C ship, i.e. designated to be scrapped, and so they were scrapped over the coming years. Back to the destroyers. Proposed trials were cut back, and Z-10 was used as a training hulk for high-pressure boilers until October 1946, when she became an accommodation ship at the Thornycroft Yard at Southampton until declared for disposal in January 1949. Z-38 was used for initial trials in the Clyde, but then was laid up at Portsmouth until being brought into refit in November 1946, then renamed Nonsuch, and in the summer of 1947 became a trial ship for high-pressure machinery and also an air target ship, based on Rosyth. She was placed in the reserve in October 1948, and in March 1949 she was employed in the Lochstriven underwater explosion trials. These left her with a broken back and all her boiler rooms flooded by October. Subsequently, she was beached and sold for scrap, with the rear being refloated and the forward part of the ship being scrapped in situ. We'll discuss the submarines in a future video, as I think they deserve one of their own. There were even smaller mine warfare vessels, coastal forces, and auxiliary vessels allocated to the UK, but none were extremely interesting, with a few exceptions of course. In particular, the boat S-30 still exists today, and is one of the last remaining such vessels today. Another interesting vessel is the auxiliary vessel Nordmark, the ex-Vestavald, where she was also captured in Copenhagen, arriving in Rosyth on June 8, 1945, with plans of refitting her for her to serve as an auxiliary tanker for the British Pacific Fleet. By the time the refit was complete, the war was over. However, she served into the 1950s as a tanker. Taking from Dodson and Kant, As already noted, the UK had undertaken to pass unwanted vessels onto France to make up for her being snubbed at Potsdam. Thus, on December 31st, 1945, the Board of the Admiralty approved the transfer of Z5, Z6, Z25, Z31, T11, T20, T23, T28, T108, U2518, and U2384. The latter two nominally on loan, U2326 was swapped for U2348 before delivery to France. The formal offer was made on January 3rd, 1946, and except the old T108, which was rejected, all were handed over a few weeks later. Other smaller craft were handed over as well, tugs, minesweepers, and the like. Other nations like the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway felt they were due some vessels, but it was a bit difficult to find everything everyone wanted. So a total of 21 R-boats were given to Denmark and 9 to the Netherlands, with France receiving 16 and 13 to Norway. I'd like to remind everyone that we will cover the U-boats at a future date, but let's check out another Axis power, the Italians and the Regia Marina. Now, the Regia Marina was in an interesting position, as in 1943, the Italian government had torn away from their German allies to turn to the invading Allied powers, and with that, a period of co-belligerency with the Allied powers began. However, for a vast majority of the remainder of the Second World War, the major surface vessels of the Regia Marina were inactive in Allied-controlled ports, notably the remaining battleships of the Littorio class, Italia and Vittorio Veneto, with their sister Roma being sunk by German-guided bombs in September 1943. To stray away from the complex negotiations, the Italian government signed a peace treaty in Paris in 1947, which came into effect on September 15th, in which the once powerful Italian Navy was soon to be broken up, with the Allied powers such as France, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and of course the United States, at least according to the treaty, were to receive ships. Under the provisions of the treaty, the Italian Navy would retain 2 battleships, the 2 Andrea Doria-class ships, 4 cruisers, 4 destroyers, 13 torpedo boats, 20 corvettes, 30 minesweepers, 8 smaller boats, and a range of auxiliary vessels. Excess vessels beyond those limits were to be placed at the disposal of the nations previously mentioned. The vessels that were to be handed over needed to be fully equipped, in operational condition, including a full outfit of armament stores, and complete with onboard spare parts and all necessary technical data. The big question to answer is what ship everyone wanted. Well, other nations like Greece and Yugoslavia wanted smaller vessels like destroyers, with Greece desiring 2 light cruisers with a third for cannibalization, while Yugoslavia got several torpedo boats. Now, France received some of Italy's more interesting vessels of the Capitani Romani class, like Attilo Regolo, Pompeo Magno, Scipio Africano, and some other smaller craft. The Soviets received the elderly battleship Giulio Cesare, even though their ambitions earlier were for them to receive a Littorio-class ship. They did receive other ships like cruisers, submarines, and destroyers, something you can hear about in my video on Soviet war prizes. Now, the Americans and British were very eager to get their hands on the Littorio class, with the British to receive Vittorio Veneto and the United States to receive Littorio, and of course smaller craft. The British had some consideration for reactivation of the Italian ship, as their fleet was going to be rather elderly by 1947, with Vanguard, of course, being the newest battleship. But as we learned in my Littorio class video, Vittorio Veneto would be scrapped. Taking from Dodson and Kahn again, the only real initial British interest was in Vittorio Veneto, and during the early months of 1946, discussions took place as to whether to actually take her, and if so, to what purpose. Commissioning was not ruled out, especially with the cost of bringing her up to British standards was less than the potential outlay for modernizing the 1920s built battleships HMS Nelson and Rodney, which was still under consideration at this time. Subsequently, the MTBs MS-72, MS-73, and MS-74 were added to the list for short-term use in trials before being given to France. Due to a variety of complicated reasons, the Italians didn't want to part with any of these vessels, especially their modern battleships, with them delaying as long as possible to give them to the Allied powers. Both the USA and the UK were entirely willing to waiver their share of the spoils if the Italians agreed to scrap them or put them to civilian use, with talks of Vittorio Veneto being used as a target ship. Taking from Dodson and Kant, the USA made its announcement on October 5th, stating that it wished its allocations of vessels to be scrapped and utilized as a contribution to the continued recovery of the Italian economy. However, at this point, the list of which nation would receive what had not been made available to Italy. And while the British had now made a decision in principle to waive for scrap all but Vittorio Veneto and 3 of the MTBs, no announcement was yet forthcoming. One concern over giving up the battleship was that the Soviets might then raise the idea of a swap of one of the now-to-be scrapped Littorios for their ancient Cesare. The Italians would take their time in scrapping Vittorio Veneto in Italia, hopefully to delay it as long as possible, as to possibly retain the 2 battleships, at least for training purposes. Nevertheless, they were broken up in the 1950s, with the Soviets asking for the possible swap of the unwanted modern battleships. With that, by the end of October, the British Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, recommended to the Prime Minister that all but 3 of the MTBs would be kept by the Italians and scrapped, with the equivalent to Vittorio Veneto scrap yield handed over to the UK. This was agreed to with Italy on October 31st, the terms making it clear that all vessels were to be scrapped or sunk by June 15, 1948. And that Italy would not invoke the UK's decision in seeking any similar concession from France or Greece. The agreement provided for the delivery of 20,000 tons of scrap steel sold to the UK at cost price, which wasn't complete until 1952. Still, in May 1948, takeover of the MTBs was also waived, meaning the UK's entire allocation of Italian ships had now been renounced. Thus, the UK only received scrap from the Italians. Finally, we'll go to the Far East and her last major Axis power, Japan. Starting with Dodson and Kant, because they're premier authority on the subject, the Potsdam Declaration had determined that the Japanese military forces shall be completely disarmed. To implement this policy, the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP, issued on September 21st a U.S. initial post-surrender policy for Japan, which stated that Japan's ground, air, and naval forces shall be disarmed and disbanded, and the naval vessels shall be surrendered and shall be disposed of as required by SCAP. As in Germany, it was agreed that all submarines should be sunk. A bit of a spoiler for future videos, sorry. However, smaller vessels should be divided between the UK, USA, USSR, and China. SCAP decreed on April 2, 1946, that all larger vessels should be destroyed, as should all wrecks in shallow waters. This means ships like Nagato and Sakawa should be destroyed, something you can learn about in my American Spoils of War video, link in the description. Technically interesting submarines like I-202 were examined, and there was thought of giving her to the UK, but that would make the USR desire a similar vessel, so she was sunk, along with the other submarines, which were done at the direction of the British, including some U-boats, a story for another time perhaps. Like with the German fleet, decisions on the fate of the Imperial Japanese Navy were made by drawing lots. The remaining vessels were divided into equal lots. On February 27, 1947, representatives proceeded to Tokyo to begin the drawing, which occurred in several phases, with each nation receiving roughly the same number of each type of vessel at the end of the day. Vessels that were won by the various nations would be brought by Japanese crews to nominated ports, accompanied by transports to repatriate Japanese personnel. There were some adjustments with the Dominions, and they would receive some smaller craft, but nothing too much. In June, the first lots were drawn, where the UK received the destroyers Kusunoki, Hagi, and Takei, the escorts Kaibokan, numbers 8, 32, and 55, and Fukei, and Habuto. In the July draw, the UK received the destroyers Sumure, Maki, and Yukaze, and the escorts Kaibokans number 16, 27, 60, and 126, and Kanawa. In the draw in August, they received this destroyer, as I literally can't pronounce it, the escorts Kaikobans numbers 29, 154, 156, 160, and 217, and Kurashi in the transport 19. The fourth and final batch was in September 1947, where the UK received the torpedo boat Hatsukari, the mine layers Kiyosai, and Wakataka, the submarine chaser 21, and the minesweeper W-102, a vessel that should have been given to the UK already, as she was laid down for the UK and Hong Kong, but was completed by the Japanese. These vessels were going to Singapore, as that was the port chosen by the UK. As was previously mentioned, the UK didn't really have any interest in long-term use of these vessels, especially with these Japanese examples. So after the first 2 batches, it was decided the other 2 batches should stay in Japan for scrapping. There was some issue with this, as the scrapping currently taking place in Singapore didn't help the scrap iron shortage in the UK, with some hoping they could be taken back to the UK. But in most cases, the vessels were scrapped locally. Although the UK didn't receive a lot of flashy ships like the US or the Soviet Union did, they nevertheless received some useful vessels and/or scrap that was very useful to a nation following such a devastating conflict like the Second World War. I think the next video in this series will be a video on the submarines, covering where they all went, or maybe just the U-boats, because it could get long. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe, as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.